makes the things more complicated for us and our lives as students of English literature and as teachers of English literature. Let's look at the next problem on our hand. We are thinking of literature in English language, which is translated from other languages. We also study literature from other languages like Gujarati, from Tamil. We can also think of languages like French and German translated into English, and we often study such texts in our during our MA and BA courses.
One of the texts which is commonly prescribed for English literature courses is The Doll's House, and it was not written in English, it was only translated into English. Similarly, when we read the Gitanjali in our English language classrooms, we are reading a text which was originally written in Bengali. The idea of studying English translation in our English literature courses is a new one. It is something which has come into our courses only in the last 15 or 20 years. Earlier, we would not be studying translations of Indian writings into English. But one good thing as a result of this, we get to study our own culture more closely through these translations. We no longer study a foreign language or a foreign literature as if it is something far away from us. Now, literature can bring our own culture closer to us.
And interestingly, English language has a role to play in bringing our own literature closer to us. Think about Tamil literature, which is accessible to a Gujarati person or a Bengali person. So, the term English literature is extremely complicated, having shades and variety of meanings, ranging from indications of nationality, indicating a language that is English. It indicates also the region called England, but it also indicates literature which is translated from other languages to English language. So what we have is a very complex and varied body of text which go under the name of English literature. And I feel that this diversity is something that is to be celebrated. And
don't you think that it is in some way very like India itself?
Exactly.
A wide variety of people, languages, cultures, but all housed under one nation. In the same way, we have a varied body of texts all housed under the title English literature.
So we have reached a point where we are able to distinguish between the two ways of using the term literature, and we have also reached a point where we can talk about the term English literature and various connotations of the term English literature. Now, as we proceed further in our study of English literature, the first thing that comes to our mind is the idea of genre. And interestingly, when a student is asked, what are you studying? Then usually students reply in terms of genres. We are studying poems or novels or plays. That's what we do usually. But these things, the technical term for this is genre. So let's look at the term genre closely. The next slide would be, what is genre?
The word genre comes from the French, but before that, Latin word for kind or class. The term is widely used to refer to a distinctive type of text. Next.
When we think of types of text in literature, some of the broad classification of the various literary texts would be as follows. Now let's have a look at the next slide. In literature, the main genres are poetry, prose, and drama.
Within drama, there are further divisions such as tragedy and comedy within the category of drama. And in prose, you also have the distinction between short story, novel, and essay. In poetry, the broad classification between epic poetry and lyric poetry. So you can see that each of these three broad genres are subdivided and further divided into smaller and smaller category. And as you study more and more literature, you will find out more and more about smaller and smaller categories within these genres.
Deepta, it's also interesting to keep in mind that the use of word literature with the definite article also has its own classification. For example, you can think in terms of genres of various variety of writings which is not classified as literature. For example, things like a letter can also be thought of as a genre
Or
itself.
sports writing,
Right.
travel writing, diary writing. But sometimes today the overlap between these forms of writing and the writing that you find in literature without the definite article is blurring. The distinctions are falling apart, and now a well written travelogue can also be a part of English literature.
So this blurring of genres is probably what Shakespeare had in mind when he was making fun of all various genres of drama. So let's have a look at what Shakespeare had to say with tongue in his cheek about the whole idea, whole business of genre.
Yeah.
Shakespeare refers sarcastically to the classification of genres in his very famous play Hamlet. He talks of tragedy, comedy, history, pastoral, pastoral comical, historical pastoral, tragical comical, historical pastoral.
I think, Sachin, what Shakespeare was trying to point out was that more important than a division or subdivision, what is more important is what a text is trying to do, what it is trying to say, and how it is put together as a literary text.
Right. So, genre is the term that all students of literature should keep in mind, and this is what you will be studying usually when you reply to someone that I'm studying literature. You imply a literary genres very often. So, you can also think of one of the definitions of the term literature would be, in a very common way of saying in layman's language, would be the study of genres which are classified as literary. The other term, which is also very important to us, is the term called literary studies. So, the question that comes to our mind is, why do we need to study literature? Because it's an important part, important component of our culture and society. Then, how should we study it? And in what way will we study it? Now, these are the questions which scholars and critics have addressed for a long period of time. So let's have a look at the term literary studies.
Literary studies is an all inclusive term for the systematic study of literary texts. It adds to our knowledge of literature. It includes literary theory, literary criticism, and literary history.
Very important term, word here would be the word systematic. And that is the reason why it adds to the body of knowledge about literature. Now that we know why we need to study literature, we should also think of how to study literature, and literary studies is a term that is used for a systematic inquiry, a study of literary texts. And
I think we should pay attention. If we go back to the slide, we can see that there are three aspects to the study of literature. One, it is literary theory. Number two, literary criticism. And three, literary history. It is when, so the systematic study of literature can be either or all of these three aspects.
yeah, so let us look in greater detail at the terms like literary theory, literary criticism, and literary history. The next slide here talks about what do we understand by the term literary criticism.
Literary criticism is a reasoned and systematic discussion of literature. It usually does not have the negative meaning we usually associate with the word criticism. This means that it does not mean to say that this kind of text is bad or that is not well written, but rather literary criticism studies systematically and deeply what is literature. So, in a way, when you study English literature, you are learning to become a critic of English literature. You are not learning to write English literature, but you are learning to do literary criticism.
An analogy which I often give to my students is when you watch a film and report to your friends about how it was, you might first just say, I liked the film or I didn't like the film, I didn't like this. But once you start giving reasons to that, once you start explaining things, once you start using a systematic kind of language to discuss what you
You
experience.
say that the dialogue was unnatural or the actor didn't act well, the songs were rubbish, it is then that you start becoming a critic.
Exactly. So criticism involves, that's the meaning of the term reason that we used earlier. It involves reasoning and it should be systematic. These are the expectations from a critical discourse. Another analogy which I use for my student is that criticism is also a form of language that you use to talk about literature. It's the way of speaking about literary text or works of art. So in itself, it's a form of language.
By this, I think, Sachin, perhaps you mean that literary criticism has its own technical terms.
Exactly.
Technical terms with which the discussion of literature takes place is the language of literary criticism. So, it is important as students of literature to have familiarity with technical terms of literary criticism. So, when you discuss a novel, you should know what the difference is between a story and a plot. You should know what an atmosphere is or what a setting is. So, it is these things, it is the knowledge of these aspects which allow you to become a better literary critic.
Now let us look at various types of criticism. There are many theoretical approaches to literary criticism, but there are two broad categories of literary criticism. So let's look at the two main types of criticism here. Let's look at the next slide.
We usually contrast theory with practice, that is, thinking about something to actually doing something. Hence, we can think of two types of criticism: theoretical criticism, which is thinking about literature, and practical criticism, which is about the analysis of literature.
So let's look at the terms theoretical criticism and practical criticism a little bit more closely, because as students of literature we are expected to understand the distinction between two, though the distinction is not very natural or normal at particular point. It breaks down just because relationship between theory or reflection and acting or practice is always a complicated one, but it's a very useful distinction to make. So let's look at the next slide, which looks at both the terms a little bit more closely. The theoretical criticism, or what is understood as literary theory.
More generalized, abstract and conceptual discussion of literature, like the definition of literariness, classification of various types of literature, relation of literature and society, literary values, and so on, is called literary theory.
So what is implied by theory here is that it's very general and at the same time it's very abstract. So one of the reasons why students find it difficult to grapple with criticism and theoretical criticism is because it's very abstract, very general and very conceptual.
but it is also very important to learn a little bit of literary theory. That is because if we only studied individual texts, we would never understand the relationship between texts. So we would never understand the relationship between literature and our culture. We would not understand the relation between literature and history. So literary theory allows us to see connections between texts, between literature and society, literature and history. So I'm afraid, hard as it might be, we should not and cannot get away from it.
What it implies probably is that we are looking at the bigger picture, not just the specific text. So how is the particular text that you are looking is related to the bigger picture and the bigger questions like what is literature, or what is function of literature, how does it relate to society, what is uh, meaning of the term literature for society and its history. So these are very big issues that theory usually raises, and these are extremely crucial for enhanced understanding of literary texts. And so it's very interesting when you contrast it with practical criticism. So let's have a look at the term practical
Practical
criticism.
criticism. Just some information for you. Examples of literary theory. You can see that literary theory is very, very old and it took place in all parts of the world. You have Aristotle Poetics, written in 335 BCE in Greek, and Bharata's Natya Shastra of India, which is written perhaps in 200 BCE. Around there, nobody exactly knows where it was written, and these